Lena gave Daniel 7 years of her life, 5 unborn children, and every ounce of love she had, only for him to leave her for her best friend, Claire. When their wedding day arrived, bathed in golden light and filled with promises of a future that should have been hers, Lena was there, and she wasn't there to celebrate. Lena and Daniel's love story began like a fairy tale. They met in college during their first year, drawn together by a natural connection that felt almost destined. Daniel was charming, ambitious, and had a way of making Lena feel like she was the only woman in the world. She was intelligent, kind-hearted, and deeply in love. Their relationship blossomed quickly, and soon they were inseparable. Lena believed that Daniel was her future. She shaped her entire life around him, prioritizing their relationship over everything else. When he struggled with academics, she tutored him late into the night. When he lost his job after graduation, she worked extra hours to support them both. She believed in him, in his dreams, in their shared future. No matter how difficult things got, Lena held on, trusting that their sacrifices would one day pay off. But not all sacrifices were equal. Over the years, Lena found herself making the hardest choices alone. The first time she got pregnant, she was terrified but secretly hopeful. She imagined a future where she and Daniel became parents, where they built a family together. But when she told him, his reaction was not what she expected. He was not angry, but he was firm. This was not the right time. He had plans, ambitions, and a child would slow them down. He convinced her it was for the best, that there would be a better time later. Lena agreed. She trusted him. The second time, it was harder. She cried in the clinic bathroom, feeling the weight of loss settle over her like a dark cloud. The third time, she hesitated, but Daniel's words were always the same. Not yet. By the fourth pregnancy, something inside Lena had changed. She no longer shared the news with excitement or hope. Instead, she simply told Daniel and waited for his familiar reasoning. And just like before, he made his case. He still wasn't ready. He needed to focus on his career, they needed financial stability, and a child would complicate everything. She listened, nodded, and numbly went through the motions of ending yet another pregnancy. The fifth time, she felt nothing at all. Despite everything, she stayed. She convinced herself that this was love, that her sacrifices were proof of her devotion, that Daniel truly wanted a future with her. But over time, things began to shift. Daniel no longer looked at her the way he once did. He became distracted, his affection turning into routine gestures rather than genuine passion. He spent more time on his phone, went out more frequently without her, and his excuses became vague. Lena sensed something was wrong, but she refused to acknowledge it. She had invested too much, given too much, lost too much. She couldn't afford to believe that it had all been for nothing. But deep down, she feared that was exactly the truth. Lena had always trusted Daniel, even when her instincts whispered that something was wrong. But trust can be a dangerous thing when placed in the wrong hands. The changes in Daniel's behavior were subtle at first. Missed calls, late replies, a growing disinterest in their conversations. He started coming home later than usual, blaming work or last-minute meetings. He became protective of his phone, angling the screen away when she was nearby, silencing notifications, and excusing himself to take calls in private. At first, Lena dismissed her suspicions. She told herself she was overthinking, that stress and exhaustion were making her paranoid. But the doubts were relentless, creeping into her mind during quiet moments, filling her thoughts with unease. She began watching him more closely, noticing things she had ignored before, the scent of unfamiliar perfume on his shirts, the way he avoided eye contact when she asked about his day, the sudden, inexplicable excitement that lit up his face whenever he glanced at his phone. One evening, she decided to check his messages while he was in the shower. Her hands trembled as she unlocked his phone, her heart pounding in her chest. What she saw made her stomach drop. A name she knew well, Claire. Claire had been her best friend since college, the one person who had stood by her side through every struggle. They had shared secrets, laughed over late-night talks, and supported each other through heartbreaks. Claire had comforted her after every painful decision, held her hand when she felt lost, and reassured her that everything would work out. Now, the messages between Claire and Daniel painted a different picture. The words were affectionate, intimate, words that should have been meant for Lena alone. Their conversations were filled with laughter, inside jokes, and whispered confessions of love. Some messages hinted at stolen moments together, at secret meetings when Lena had believed Daniel was at work. Lena's vision blurred with tears. The betrayal was more than she could bear. Not only had Daniel been unfaithful, but he had chosen the one person she had trusted the most. The weight of it crushed her, stealing the air from her lungs. She scrolled through the messages in disbelief, unable to look away from the proof of their deception. Then she saw it. A wedding invitation. Claire and Daniel were getting married. The date was set, the plans were in motion, and everyone seemed to know, except Lena. She read the words over and over, unable to comprehend how her life had unraveled so completely. After 7 years of sacrifices, after 5 pregnancies ended for the sake of their future, Daniel had chosen someone else. He hadn't just left her, he had erased her, replaced her, discarded her like she never mattered. A numbness spread through her body, dulling the sharp edges of her pain. She should have been shattered, broken beyond repair. But as she sat there in the silence of their home, staring at the evidence of betrayal, something inside her hardened. She wasn't going to cry. She was going to make them pay. Lena no longer felt like herself. The woman who had once loved unconditionally, who had sacrificed everything for a future that never came, was gone. In her place was someone colder, sharper, and filled with a rage that simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to erupt. She stopped eating regularly, barely slept, and avoided people. She quit her job without notice, unable to focus on anything other than the betrayal that consumed her thoughts. Every waking moment was spent analyzing the years she had given away, replaying every sacrifice, every broken promise, every lie. She had wasted 7 years of her life for a man who discarded her like she was nothing. But the worst part wasn't Daniel, it was Claire. Claire had smiled in her face, held her hand through heartbreak, comforted her during every painful moment. She had played the role of a loyal friend while secretly building a future with the man Lena had loved. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a calculated, deliberate destruction of everything Lena had once held dear. Lena watched them closely, gathering every detail she could. She followed their social media, tracking the wedding preparations, the engagement photos, the messages of congratulations from mutual friends. They flaunted their love as if she had never existed, as if the years she had spent with Daniel were nothing more than a forgettable phase in his life. The world had moved on, but Lena hadn't. She couldn't. One night, she drove past Claire's apartment, parking a distance away and watching from the shadows. The lights were on, and she could see their silhouettes moving inside. Laughter floated through the air, muffled but unmistakable. They were happy, excited, oblivious to the storm brewing just outside their door. Lena clenched her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her skin. She imagined the life they were about to have, the wedding, the honeymoon, the child they would raise together, the child Daniel never let her have, the life that should have been hers. She started researching, wedding venues, guest lists, floor plans. Every detail was important. Every bit of information brought her closer to what needed to be done. She wasn't acting on impulse. This wasn't blind rage. This was methodical, planned, necessary. She spent weeks preparing, watching, waiting. She took her time, ensuring no one would suspect what was coming. There would be no more tears, no more begging for love that wasn't real. Lena had given Daniel and Claire the chance to walk away, to leave her in peace. Instead, they had chosen to destroy her. Now, it was her turn. The wedding day was approaching, and soon they would stand together in front of their family and friends, promising each other forever. Lena had a promise of her own. She would make sure that neither of them ever got to say, "I do." The wedding day arrived, bathed in golden sunlight, a picture-perfect scene of joy and celebration. The venue, an elegant garden estate, was decorated with white roses and twinkling lights, creating an atmosphere of romance and promise. Guests arrived in elegant attire, laughing, exchanging warm embraces, completely unaware that beneath the surface of this perfect day, something sinister lurked. Claire stood in front of the mirror, radiant in her lace wedding gown, her hands gently resting on the small curve of her stomach. The baby growing inside her was a symbol of her new beginning, A life with Daniel that was everything she had ever dreamed of. She smiled at her reflection, unaware that someone else was watching, waiting, just beyond the carefully arranged walls of happiness. Lena had been planning this moment for weeks. She had memorized every detail, where the security cameras were positioned, the seating arrangements, the schedule of events. She had blended seamlessly into the background, slipping past unnoticed, just another face in the crowd. No one questioned her presence. After all, she had been part of their lives for years. The ceremony began, and the guests quieted as the music played. Claire walked down the aisle, her arm linked with her father's, her face glowing with happiness. Daniel stood at the altar, eyes filled with admiration as he watched the woman he had chosen to spend his life with. The officiant began speaking, his voice warm and steady, leading them through the vows that would bind them together forever. And then everything changed. A single scream cut through the air, high-pitched and filled with horror. The guests turned in confusion, their eyes searching for the source of the disturbance. At first, it wasn't clear what had happened, until Claire staggered backward, her white dress blooming with red. Her hands trembled as she looked down, confusion flashing across her face before the pain set in. Chaos erupted. Guests jumped from their seats, some running for safety, others frozen in shock. Daniel rushed toward Claire, catching her as she collapsed, his hands pressing desperately against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Blood soaked through the delicate fabric, dripping onto the pristine white petals scattered across the aisle. The screams multiplied as another sound echoed through the air, a second sharp, sudden noise. This time it was Daniel who fell. His body crumpled beside Claire's, his face twisted in agony as he reached toward her. The perfect wedding, the perfect future, had been shattered in an instant. Lena stood among the chaos, watching, expressionless. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, the way it would unfold, the way it would feel. But now, as she stood there, surrounded by panicked voices and the metallic scent of blood, she felt nothing. Security rushed toward her, shouts filling the air, hands grabbing at her arms. She did not resist. The damage had already been done. For 7 years, she had given everything. Today, she had taken it all back. The courtroom was silent, except for the occasional rustling of papers and muffled whispers. The trial had captured national attention, a story of love turned to betrayal, betrayal turned to revenge. The media painted Lena as a scorned woman consumed by jealousy, a murderer who had ruined what should have been the happiest day of Daniel and Claire's lives. Prosecutors described her as cold, calculating, a woman who had meticulously planned every step leading to that blood-soaked wedding. Lena sat motionless, her face blank, her hands resting in her lap as the evidence against her was laid out. The security footage, the witness testimonies, the methodical way she had orchestrated the attack. There was no doubt that she was guilty. She had not tried to run. She had not made excuses. She had simply watched as the world unraveled in front of her. Claire had survived, but just barely. She had spent weeks in the hospital, recovering not just from the physical wounds, but from the emotional devastation of losing the child she had been carrying. Daniel, on the other hand, had not been as lucky. He had died before the paramedics arrived, his last moments spent clutching Claire's bloodied hands, his face frozen in shock and pain. Claire did not testify. She couldn't bring herself to face the woman who had destroyed her life. Instead, her family spoke on her behalf, painting a picture of the grief and suffering that would haunt her forever. The dreams she had of a perfect life, a beautiful marriage, a future with the man she loved, were gone. And the person responsible sat only a few feet away, unmoved, unbothered, staring straight ahead as if none of it mattered. The defense tried to argue that Lena had been a victim, manipulated, used, discarded. They spoke of the 7 years she had spent devoted to Daniel, of the 5 pregnancies she had ended for his sake, of the ultimate betrayal that had pushed her to the edge. They described a woman who had lost everything, who had watched as the people she loved most ripped her world apart. But none of it mattered. The jury reached a verdict in less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. When the judge sentenced Lena to life in prison without parole, there was no reaction from her. She neither cried nor spoke. There was no outburst, no plea for mercy. She simply stood as the verdict was read, nodded once, and allowed herself to be led away. Years later, her name still lingered in conversations, in articles and documentaries dissecting every moment of the crime. Some saw her as a villain, a woman so consumed by rage that she destroyed lives without remorse. Others saw her as a tragic figure, a woman whose love had been taken for granted until it drove her to madness. But Lena didn't care what the world thought. For the first time in years, she felt at peace.